It's 11:47 p.m. in New York City, October 1976. Frank Sinatra stands alone in his dressing room at the Uris Theatre. The show ended an hour ago. The applause has faded. The crowds have gone home. But Frank hasn't moved. He's staring at an envelope on his makeup table. An envelope that wasn't there when he walked off stage. An envelope addressed in handwriting he would recognize anywhere. Ava's handwriting. The woman who destroyed him. The woman he destroyed. The woman he never stopped loving. His hands are shaking as he picks it up. The paper is yellowed, aged, as if it traveled through decades to reach him. He turns it over and sees the date written in the corner. The 15th of October 1996. 20 years in the future, Frank Sinatra has faced mob bosses, presidents, and his own demons. But nothing has ever terrified him like this. Because the letter isn't just impossible. It's addressed to a version of him that doesn't exist yet, and what's written inside will haunt him for the rest of his life. To understand the weight of that envelope, you need to understand Ava Gardner. You need to understand what she meant to Frank Sinatra, not what the tabloids said, not what the gossip columns printed. The truth. They met in 1949, two broken people pretending to be whole. Frank was married to Nancy, drowning in a marriage that felt like obligation. Ava was Hollywood's most dangerous woman, having already burned through Mickey Rooney and Artie Shaw. She drank too much, she fought too hard, she loved too deeply. When Frank saw her at a party in Palm Springs, something cracked open inside him. She wasn't impressed by him. Everyone was impressed by Frank Sinatra in 1949. But Ava looked at him like he was just another man trying too hard. It made him crazy. It made him obsessed. Their affair was a wildfire that consumed everything. Frank left Nancy. The Catholic Church condemned him. His career collapsed. He went from selling out arenas to playing half-empty clubs. He lost his recording contract. He lost his movies. He lost everything. Except Ava. They married in 1951, and for a brief moment, they were happy. But happiness was a language neither of them spoke fluently. They fought like animals. Jealous rages. Broken dishes. Screaming matches that neighbors could hear 3 houses away. They divorced in 1957, but they never really ended. For the next 40 years, they would circle each other like wounded planets, unable to stay together, unable to stay apart. Phone calls at 3 a.m. Letters that arrived without warning. Brief reunions that ended in tears. Frank would send her money when she needed it. Ava would send him birthday cards with no return address. They were connected by something deeper than love. Something that felt like destiny or punishment. By 1976, Frank had rebuilt everything. He was chairman of the board. He had conquered Vegas, Hollywood, and the world. But Ava was fading. She was living in London, drinking too much, her beauty ravaged by time and regret. They hadn't spoken in months. And then, on a cold October night in New York, an impossible letter appeared in his dressing room. Frank Sinatra in 1976 was 60 years old and exhausted. The swagger was still there, the sharp suits and the perfect hair, but underneath, the machinery was grinding down. 3 marriages behind him, countless affairs, a lifetime of burning bridges and building empires. He still performed with precision, but the hunger was gone. He sang because singing was all he knew how to do. His dressing room at the Uris Theatre was modest by his standards. A mirror surrounded by lights, a bottle of Jack Daniels, mostly untouched. Photographs of his children. And one photograph he never showed anyone, tucked into the corner of his mirror. Ava, young and laughing, from a day in Spain when they forgot to be unhappy. His road manager, a quiet man named Tony, had been with Frank for 15 years. Tony knew when to speak and when to disappear. Tonight, Tony had disappeared the moment he saw Frank's face. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Frank's hands, those hands that could conduct an orchestra with a single gesture, were trembling like leaves. The envelope sat on the table like a grenade with the pin pulled. Frank knew Ava's handwriting better than his own. The elegant loops, the slight tilt to the right. The way she crossed her T's with a flourish. This was her hand. There was no question. But the date made no sense. The 15th of October 1996. It was currently October 1976. The letter was dated 20 years from now. Frank poured himself a drink. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the glass, at the amber liquid catching the light, and tried to make his brain work. Someone was playing a joke. That had to be it. Some sick bastard had forged Ava's handwriting and was trying to mess with his head. But who would do that? Who even knew that Ava's letters still meant something to him? He picked up the envelope again. It was real. The paper was real. The age was real. It smelled faintly of her perfume, that jasmine scent she always wore. Frank's finger slid under the seal. The envelope opened with a soft tear. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it slowly, as if moving too fast might make the words disappear. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but each sentence hit him like a bullet. "Francis," it began. She always called him Francis when she was serious. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. Not just from your life, but from everything. I'm writing this in 1996, in a London hospital, knowing that I have days left, not weeks. The doctors are kind. They don't tell me the truth, but I can see it in their eyes. I wanted to write to you one last time, not to the Frank of 1996, who has his own letter waiting, but to the Frank of 1976, the Frank who still has time." Frank stopped reading. His chest was tight. He couldn't breathe. This was impossible. This was absolutely impossible. But the words kept pulling him back. "I know what you're thinking. This is a trick. A joke. Some cruelty from a universe that has been cruel to us both. But it's not. I don't know how this letter will reach you. I only know that it must. Because there are things I never said. Things I was too proud to admit. And pride, Francis, is the most expensive thing either of us ever owned." Frank's hands were shaking so badly the paper was rustling. He set it down on the table and pressed his palms flat, trying to steady himself. He looked at the photograph of young Ava in his mirror. She was smiling at him from 30 years ago. He looked back at the letter. "I loved you," it continued. "I know you know that. But what you don't know, what I never told you, is that I never stopped. Not for a single day. Every man after you was a shadow. Every drink was trying to forget what we lost. You think I left because I didn't love you enough. The truth is, I left because I loved you too much. And I didn't know how to love that much without burning us both alive." Frank stood up. He walked to the small window and looked out at the city. New York was alive below him, millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in this tiny room, a man was watching his past and future collide. He thought about all the nights he'd spent hating her, all the times he'd cursed her name, all the women he'd married trying to replace her. None of it worked. None of it ever worked. He returned to the letter. "I'm asking you for something, Francis, not forgiveness. We're both too stubborn for that. I'm asking you to stop waiting. Stop punishing yourself for what we were. Stop carrying me like a stone around your neck. In 20 years, when you're an old man and I'm a memory, I want you to know that what we had was worth it. Every fight, every tear, every sleepless night. It was worth it because it was real. And real things, Francis, are the only things that matter." Frank read the final paragraph 3 times. His eyes were burning. The legendary cool, the armor he'd built over 60 years, was cracking. "I don't know if you'll believe this letter is real. I don't know if it matters. But I needed to say these words before I couldn't say anything anymore. You were the love of my life. You were the worst thing that ever happened to me. You were everything. Goodbye, Francis. Don't waste the years I won't have. All my love, forever and too late, Ava." Frank set the letter down. The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic. He walked to the mirror and looked at himself. 60 years old, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. He picked up the photograph of young Ava. Her smile was so bright it hurt to look at. "How?" he whispered to the empty room. "How did you do this?" There was no answer. There would never be an answer. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to his heart. Then he did something he hadn't done in decades. Frank Sinatra sat down in his dressing room chair, put his face in his hands, and wept. He wept for the years they wasted fighting. He wept for the words they never said. He wept for a letter that couldn't possibly exist but somehow did. He wept for a woman who was dying in a future he couldn't reach. And when the tears finally stopped, something had changed. The weight he'd been carrying, that stone she mentioned, felt lighter. Not gone, but lighter. Frank never told anyone about the letter. Not his family. Not his friends. Not the biographers who would eventually pick apart every detail of his life. It was his secret. His impossible secret. In the weeks that followed, people noticed a change in him. He called his children more often. He was kinder to his band. He stopped picking fights with journalists. Something had softened in him, though no one could say what. He continued to perform, of course. The voice never stopped. But there was a different quality to his singing now. When he sang about lost love, there was an acceptance that hadn't been there before. Not surrender, just acceptance. He kept the letter in a safe in his home. Every few months, he would take it out and read it again. The paper never aged further. The ink never faded. It remained exactly as it was, a message from a future that hadn't happened yet. In 1990, he learned that Ava was ill. Her emphysema had worsened. She was confined to her London apartment, too weak to travel. Frank sent her money. He sent her flowers. He called her twice a week, long conversations about nothing and everything. She never mentioned the letter. He never asked. On the 25th of January 1990, Ava Gardner died. Frank was performing in Atlantic City when he got the news. He finished the show. He always finished the show. But backstage, Tony found him holding the letter, tears streaming down his face. "She knew," Frank whispered. "She knew all along." The letter had been dated the 15th of October 1996. Ava died in January 1990. The math didn't work. Nothing about it worked. But Frank had stopped trying to understand. Some things weren't meant to be understood. They were just meant to be felt. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the right moment to say what we feel, waiting for the perfect time to make things right, waiting for closure that arrives on our schedule. But closure doesn't work that way. It comes when it comes, if it comes at all. Sometimes it arrives 20 years too early. Sometimes it arrives 20 years too late. Sometimes it appears as an impossible letter in an empty dressing room, written by a hand that won't write it for another 2 decades. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner never got the ending they wanted. They never reconciled in some grand romantic gesture. They never walked into the sunset together. Their love story was messy and painful and incomplete. But maybe that's what made it real. The letter, whatever it was, wherever it came from, taught Frank something he'd been too proud to learn on his own. Love doesn't need a perfect ending to be perfect. It just needs to be true. And what they had, for all its destruction, was the truest thing either of them ever knew. We all have our own letters that need to be written, words we've left unsaid, people we've let drift away because we thought there would always be more time. But time, as Frank learned that night in New York, doesn't play by our rules. It arrives when it wants. It leaves when it's ready. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it sends us a message from a future we can't quite reach. The question isn't whether you believe the letter was real. The question is whether you'll wait for your own impossible moment or whether you'll pick up the phone tonight. This is the part of Frank Sinatra's story the spotlight never touched. Not the swagger, not the songs. Just a man alone in a dressing room, holding a letter that couldn't exist, weeping for a love that never truly ended. This was Frank Sinatra, Legacy Confidential. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who understands that love doesn't always make sense, and tell us in the comments, what words have you left unsaid? What letter would you write if you knew you were running out of time? Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story. because the legends we think we know are never the whole truth. Keep swinging, pal.